I remember the moment with startling clarity. My name is Elise, I'm 34, and looking back, I can't fathom what possessed me. The kitchen was bathed in late afternoon light as I sat with my sister Claire, words spilling from my lips with dangerous abandon, words that should have remained locked in the private chambers of my thoughts. If I could go back and do it all again, I confided, my voice carrying that casual inflection reserved for trivial matters, I wouldn't choose Nathan. I just wouldn't. The statement hung in the air, deceptively light for something so laden with consequence. I treated the declaration about my husband with the same offhand delivery one might use to discuss a regrettable restaurant choice, not a 7-year marriage. Perhaps some part of me wanted to be overheard, some self-destructive impulse, seeking confrontation. Or maybe I had simply grown careless with the power words hold. Nathan wasn't doing anything particularly egregious at that moment. He was likely in the adjacent room, scrolling through news articles as he unwound after his workday. This was our routine, comfortable and predictable. Yet there I was, undermining it all with thoughtless words. The ensuing silence wasn't from Claire. She'd weathered many of my emotional tempests. No, this silence had weight, substance, a presence of its own. I turned my head just enough to see him framed in the doorway, his expression unnervingly still. No anger flashed across his features, no demand for explanation. Nathan simply held my gaze for one excruciating moment before turning away. The front door closed with such gentle finality that my stomach clenched in response. I hadn't expected that. Nathan had always been my counterbalance, steady against my volatility, patient when I was impulsive. I anticipated an argument, perhaps, or at least visible hurt. His silent departure disrupted the script I unconsciously followed in our relationship. I didn't mean he'd actually leave, I told Claire, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow even to my own ears. He's being dramatic. He'll be back. The words tasted false, a desperate attempt to avoid confronting what I'd done. Perhaps acknowledging my cruelty would force me to examine parts of myself I wasn't ready to face. Hours passed without word from Nathan. My initial call went unanswered, so I sent a casual text. You okay? The lack of response ignited an uncomfortable mixture of indignation and anxiety. How dare he disappear? And yet, where was he? Was this some calculated lesson, or had I finally pushed beyond what even his patient nature could absorb? I remained awake until midnight, pretending to be absorbed in social media while actually waiting for the sound of his key in the lock. The silence of the house seemed accusatory, a witness to my thoughtlessness. When I finally retreated to our bedroom, I told myself I wouldn't lose sleep over his absence. The lie was exposed by the restless hours that followed. Morning arrived with Nathan's side of the bed undisturbed. His toothbrush remained in the bathroom, his shoes by the door, small domestic anchors suggesting he hadn't abandoned our life entirely. Still, uneasiness settled deeper within me. I tried again. Where are you?
Can we talk?
The digital void persisted. I've never handled silence well. When conflict arises, I need conversation, resolution, forward movement. Nathan processes differently, contemplative, measured, thoughtful. This fundamental difference has always created friction between us, but never a rupture like this. When I described the situation to Claire, she asked gently, "Maybe you should apologize?" Apologize for what? I bristled. For being honest? For expressing how I feel? He shouldn't have been eavesdropping on a private conversation. Even as I defended myself, the justification felt hollow. Deep down, a question began to form. Had I finally gone too far? Nathan typically accommodated my needs, followed my lead, traits I'd come to take for granted. For the first time, I faced the possibility that his tolerance might have limits. As a second day passed without contact, my irritation crystallized into something more complicated. If something had happened to him, surely someone would have called. But Nathan's mother hadn't heard from him either, which seeded genuine worry beneath my defensive anger. Nathan isn't impulsive or reckless. He's the most predictable person in my life, a quality I've both appreciated and found maddening. By nightfall, my thoughts spiraled between conflicting emotions. I stared at my phone, too proud to send another message, but desperately hoping for a response that never came. On the third day, while checking our shared bank account, half out of necessity, half as investigative work, I discovered a hotel charge from earlier that day. Relief flashed briefly before irritation resurged. So he was physically safe, just hiding, avoiding me as though I weren't worth confronting directly. I called the hotel immediately, but predictably, the staff refused to confirm whether he was a guest. I drafted an accusatory text. "I know where you are. Stop being childish and come home so we can talk." After staring at it for several minutes, I deleted it. If he wanted to behave this way, I wouldn't beg for his return. Yet the knot in my stomach tightened. This wasn't following our established pattern. Nathan was supposed to forgive, to understand, to ultimately let my moments of thoughtlessness pass without permanent consequence. On the fourth day, I drove to the hotel. The clerk remained professionally tight-lipped despite my increasingly desperate insistence that Nathan was my husband. Defeated, I returned to my car and confronted an emotion I'd been avoiding: fear. What if this wasn't temporary? What if I'd finally severed something essential between us? Perhaps it wasn't just about what I'd said to Claire. Maybe it represented years of small cruelties, moments when I'd prioritized my feelings over his, instances where I'd failed to see his worth. Still, I wasn't ready to apologize, not yet. I needed to see him first, to gauge his mood, to determine how to navigate this conversation to minimize my own discomfort. That evening, the front door finally opened. Nathan entered with an unsettling composure, setting his bag down deliberately. No dramatic entrance, no emotional display, just a carefully contained presence that made me acutely aware of my own chaotic energy. "We need to talk," he said, his voice level and distant. "Yeah, no kidding," I responded, arms folded defensively. Despite knowing I should apologize, I couldn't bring myself to surrender that ground. He invited me to sit. I remained standing, maintaining physical distance as though it might protect me from the emotional confrontation looming between us. "You going to explain why you disappeared for 4 days?" I asked, aiming for casual indifference, but hitting defensive hostility instead. "I needed space," he replied simply. "To think. To figure out how to even speak to you after what I heard." I rolled my eyes reflexively. "Come on, Nathan. You overheard one private comment to my sister and acted like it's the apocalypse." "It wasn't just one thing, Elise," he countered, his voice barely rising before he controlled it again. "You said you wouldn't choose me now, that you wouldn't date me if you could go back." "Well, maybe I wouldn't," I retorted impulsively, immediately regretting the words but pressing forward anyway. "You've changed. You're not the same man I married. You're lazier now. You've let yourself go. You barely try anymore. Can you really blame me for feeling this way?" Pain flashed across his features before settling into something worse: resignation. "So that's it," he said quietly. "You think I'm unattractive and lazy, and that's why you wish you hadn't chosen me. Don't twist my words." I snapped, though he'd done no such thing. "I didn't say I don't want to be with you. I said I might have made a different choice." "That's not the same." "Sounds remarkably similar to me," he observed. "And maybe you're right, I have changed. I've aged. I've gained weight. I've grown comfortable. But that's what happens in marriage, Elise. You build a life together. At least that's what I thought we were doing." Embarrassment and anger flushed my face. "Don't make this about me," I deflected. "You're distant. You barely engage unless it's about work or household matters. You're hardly giving me reason to feel excited about this marriage." "So this is my fault?" he asked, incredulous but controlled. "I'm the reason you're unhappy? The reason you can't respect me enough to keep such thoughts private?" "You're twisting everything," I exclaimed. "I'm just saying maybe if you put in more effort, worked out, showed interest in me like you used to, I wouldn't feel this way." He studied me for a long moment before standing slowly, meeting my gaze with unexpected clarity. "You know what, Elise? This reveals more about you than me." "What's that supposed to mean?" I demanded, panic rising beneath my hostility. "It means you don't appreciate what you have," he said evenly. Someone who supported you through your impulsive decisions, your spending habits, your emotional fluctuations. Someone who's never judged you for any of it. Instead of valuing that, you look for reasons to diminish me. I opened my mouth to object, but he continued. I know I'm imperfect. I know I've changed. But so have you, Elise, and not in ways that strengthen our marriage. You've become someone who deflects responsibility, who attacks rather than communicates, who would rather blame me than examine yourself. His words struck like physical blows, but rather than acknowledge their truth, I lashed out again. Oh, so you're perfect? The saint holding this marriage together while I'm the problem? He shook his head, picking up his bag. No, I'm not perfect. But at least I'm trying to be better. I'm done standing here allowing you to make me feel inadequate. If you can't see my value anymore, maybe we need distance. I froze. What are you saying? I'm saying I need more than this, he replied, gesturing between us. If you're unwilling to work on it, perhaps I shouldn't be here. He left without slamming doors or raising his voice, leaving me stunned by his quiet resolve. Weeks passed, and reality descended with merciless clarity. Nathan didn't return, not even for mail. Every room in our house seemed to echo with his absence, not just his physical presence, but the emotional space he had occupied. My attempts at communication were met with polite but impenetrable distance. Hope you're well. I'll come by this weekend for my things. No openings, no vulnerability. When he arrived to collect his belongings, I barely recognized him. His posture seemed straighter, his shoulders broader. He'd trimmed his beard with unexpected precision, and a subtle cologne I didn't recognize accompanied him. Loath as I was to admit it, he looked better than he had in years. Hey, I offered awkwardly as he entered. Hey, he responded with a slight nod before proceeding directly to the bedroom to pack. I followed, desperate to break the oppressive silence. Nathan, can we talk? He continued organizing his possessions. About what? About us, I ventured, my voice unfamiliarly soft. He paused, regarding me with an unreadable expression. What about us, Elise? You made your feelings quite clear. I didn't mean it that way, I insisted, stepping closer. I was upset. I wasn't thinking. No, Elise, he corrected me, resuming his packing. You were thinking. You just didn't expect me to hear it. The lump in my throat grew painful. I didn't intend to hurt you. But you did, he said firmly, finally meeting my gaze. And it's not just that one conversation. It's everything. How you speak to me, how you treat me. I'm perpetually insufficient for you. Tears threatened, but I maintained composure through sheer will. I was wrong. I know that. But we can fix this. We've weathered worse, haven't we? He gave a small, bitter laugh. Have we? Because I don't recall ever feeling this disrespected, this unwanted. And the worst part? I stayed. I kept trying despite clear signals that you didn't value me. That's on me. I allowed this to progress. His assessment hit with devastating accuracy. I wanted to argue, but couldn't summon the words. So that's it? You're abandoning us? My voice cracked traitorously. I'm not abandoning anything, he replied steadily. I'm choosing myself for once. I'm done trying to prove my worth to someone who refuses to see it. I stared at him, disoriented. This wasn't following our established pattern. He was supposed to forgive, to work through this together. Instead, he stood resolved, as though a decision had already crystallized within him. I can change, I whispered. I'll do better. He sighed, momentarily setting down a box. Elise, I hope you do. Not for me, but for yourself. But I can't wait for that transformation. I've spent years trying to make you happy, receiving only criticism and resentment in return. I deserve better. His assessment stunned me more than I anticipated. Tears spilled over, and for once, I made no effort to conceal them. Please, Nathan. I don't want to lose you. We can repair this. He regarded me for a prolonged moment, and briefly, something flickered across his features, compassion, perhaps, or regret. But then he shook his head. I've already sacrificed too much of myself trying to mend what you keep breaking, he said softly. I can't continue. He collected his possessions and left, while I remained frozen, confronting the possibility that I might truly lose him permanently. In subsequent days, I sought distraction, work, friends, anything to avoid solitude in our house. But emptiness followed faithfully. Nathan's absence wasn't merely physical. He had taken something essential with him. A month later, I encountered him at a cafe. He sat with a woman I didn't recognize, not conventionally stunning, but possessing an effortless grace. They were laughing, and he appeared genuinely happy, happier than I'd witnessed in years. I wanted to interrupt them, to remind him of our unresolved marriage, but remained rooted in place, watching from a distance and feeling the full weight of my mistakes. When he noticed me, his smile briefly faltered, but no anger or distress crossed his features. He offered a small nod of acknowledgement before returning to his conversation, as though I were already transitioning into memory. As I left the cafe, the consequences of my choices settled over me with crushing finality. I had invested so much energy in cataloging his deficiencies that I had failed to recognize his worth. Now it appeared too late. For the first time, I felt genuinely alone, and with stark clarity, I understood that Nathan hadn't failed me. I had failed him, and more devastatingly, I had failed myself. The reflection staring back at me from shop windows as I walked home was that of someone I scarcely recognized, someone who had taken love for granted until its absence revealed its true value.